I'm hoping we're recording because I'm going to say hello, Bill.
Hello, Sandy. How are you today?
I am fine. I am really, really excited to talk about this topic because I don't think it is what it appears to be at first glance. And just for people wondering why I've got, speaking of seeing rich and poor on the screen, in our last conversation, Bill and I sort of touched upon a sense that there may be artists or especially photographers who have a background of privilege and wealth that somehow enables something in their work. And likewise, there may be something on the flip side of that from somebody perhaps who's come from a very challenging background where what they've experienced also feeds somehow into the work, and perhaps not always in the most obvious of ways. Anyway, Bill, rich and poor.
I think that you're going to have more background on some of these artists than I am. I'm interested to hear if there's things about their backgrounds that I'm unaware of.
Well, the first artist we've got is Lowry, a British artist. And the particular painting I've chosen is Coming from the Mill, which also can be called On the Way Home from the Factory. And there are several kind of studies of this. The painting is from 1930. So it's a British painting from the interwar years. And the reason why I selected it for a conversation about rich and poor is not just because this painting and all the paintings really that Lowry produced somehow um, show us the world of an industrial north of England and people who are, I'm not going to say impoverished, but certainly workers, very much of the working class of England in the north in the first part of the 20th century. And showing us these people, have always wondered what Lowry says of himself. But also, I wonder, what anybody looking might think of this kind of painting if they're not aware of Lowry.
It's funny because I don't know this painting. I know Lowry. Um, I've seen some of his work, and as we've made jokes about before, I like that show Fake or Fortune that's on BBC.
Mhm.
And they did a Lowry episode once, which was actually really interesting. But when I look at this, it's got a little bit of like a Jacob Lawrence kind of feel to it too, like this. It's I think it's the way that some artists portray people, um, as sort of just one of many that aren't very specific people in their works, and it's also of the time period and of sort of a downtrodden class. Of course, Jacob Lawrence was doing you know Black Americans in the middle of the 20th century and all the rest of it. But I think it's got a similar. It comes from a similar place. I feel like. I mean, there is an impersonalness to the people in this. You know what I mean? Like they're all just cogs in a machine kind of feel.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm not sure, Bill, what you do know in terms of Lowry's own background. So he didn't grow up in abject poverty, but he certainly did have um, a childhood that he described himself as being a difficult childhood. He had a father who, by all accounts, was a very decent man, but who was nonetheless a very absent emotional figure. In that, there's something that the somebody somewhere said about the dad. He just wanted to kind of disappear into the wallpaper. He didn't want to be a presence. It was as if he determined that he had this life to live and he was just going to get on and live it and get it over with as fast as possible. So not somebody who was full of joy.
yeah,
Um, and by all accounts, Lowry's mother was a very conflicted character. She had kind of incredible ambition. I think she wanted to be a concert pianist, and perhaps so that by having her son, she was in actual fact thwarted in her ambitions in some way. Lowry grew up in a house where I'm not sure how much love there was to spare. Um,
I think that's a lot of houses.
that is a lot of houses, but just before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the automatic assumption that when we put a title like Rich and Poor, we're talking about something that's to do with money, when in actual fact, not necessarily. We could be
Sure.
talking about an emotional poverty, and that
Yeah.
somehow that emotional poverty may create the conditions in which somebody really searches for something in their life and
Sure.
wants to
I
fill
mean,
the.
I always think about, I guess famously Picasso's father was like a medium level artist who was always jealous of his son's talent and ability. You could imagine in some therapist's office, if it came right down to it, it's just, you know, you can imagine Pablo sitting there going, I just want to like do stuff that makes my father feel like crap or whatever, you know what I mean? Or whatever. I just want to beat my dad. All this like sort of father son, mother daughter kind of stuff, you know what I mean? That happens all the time. And how much, yeah, I mean, the who was it the other day? It was, the model that Stephanie Seymour's son died of, 24 years old, died of pills or whatever, and you think, kid had everything he could possibly want materially,
Mm.
um, but obviously there was something really missing in his life for him to have fallen off the road that way. And sometimes I think about it a lot of times when I look at, artists who maybe didn't get enough parental love or got the wrong kind of love as a child, and you can tell that the rest of their lives was just trying to make up for that in some way. Sometimes that leads to really good art though.
It does, and I think, in terms of looking at the time in which this painting was created in 1930, the interwar years were a really rich period in terms of art more broadly in the European West and in the States, of course. But just to note that, Lowry was, of course, informed by what he could see. And in Pendlebury and Salford, where he lived and then worked, he was obviously able to encounter scenes like this frequently. But what I think is fascinating about these paintings, as you've already identified, the figures within the frame are almost anonymized. We
Yeah.
understand them as human figures and a sense of movement. And I want to come back to the title in just a second. But the other thing to note about them is that none of these figures cast a shadow.
I didn't notice that, but yeah, none of them have faces either.
So what does that really say? I mean, the establishment would say that, Lowry's art could be classed as naive art, it's folk art, all kinds of ways in which established critic, the art establishment, like to put painters down. They're a kind of loaded language that could be used to diminish what might actually be a very successful art form. And I think perhaps Lowry was in that kind of group of artists who were not perhaps given the same credit as artists working at the same time who may have met the expectations of an art elite, for example.
Yeah, but isn't that always the case? I mean, gatekeepers are almost always wrong when it comes to art. You know, how many artists were unknown in their lifetimes and now are lifted up, and how many who were really something in their lifetimes who were completely forgotten? I mean, it's just as likely one or the other.
Well, I think
Um,
another really interesting point for our title. You know,
yeah.
when I was doing a little bit of research for the paintings and images I've chosen for the presentation, I found quite a lot of scholarly papers on art representing poverty, but I
Yep.
also found lots of people writing about the top 10 artists who died unknown,
Sure.
who had never, Van Gogh never sold never sold a painting in his
Sure.
life. Lowry wasn't like that, but Lowry did have um, quite a level of fame in his lifetime. He was well known, he was well regarded by, I think, ordinary people. And I'm saying that not in any way as a diminishment. I'm saying that as something that did, in fact, elevate him. That what is more important than painting of the people, that the people respond to, understand, and enjoy, And going back to the
Yeah.
sense of coming from the mill, in Lowry's paintings, there is always a sense that there's a toing and a froing between places. So people who are on the way to work or on the way home from work, they're on the way to the factory or they're on the way to the football match or they're coming home from, all these different locations that again would have been in
But
line.
he's watching them, all these things. He's never a participant, right?
He's always watching them, and also the illusion is that from a distance. But I do think that perhaps, much as he's given us distance between his vantage and then the first line of people we see, we are still aware that we're kind of, like you say, faceless, shadowless. We leave no marks. We're not important enough as individuals to leave those kinds of indelible prints on surfaces. We're not important to allow the light to cast anything from us. We are not insignificant together, but as individuals, yes, we are. And I wonder again about his parents in this. That much as, yes, he would have been able to see people coming and going from a factory easily where he lived, nonetheless, there's still a sense that, his dad wanting to be almost invisible in life. Lowry is bringing this perhaps forward into painting. I don't think that's going too far with a kind of assumption about somebody forming their character in the conditions of a home in which there was perhaps little obvious love. I mean, there's lots of evidence, like, books that Lowry was given as a boy are inscribed on the inside, and it says to our darling Lowry, by his parents. So there was obviously a lot of affection, but whether that affection was able to be expressed in a more kind of conventional way that perhaps you or I might hope for with our families, I'm not sure that Lowry ever had that.
You know what? Can I just go back to one thing you said though? When you said that you found all these lists of people who were undiscovered or sort of failures in their art during their lifetimes.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing though that you have this idea that there are people who are making art and no one cares, Sandy? Like they can't anybody, no one will look at it, no one will buy it, no one whatever. And you know what? They kept doing it. How many other things would somebody who was so completely ignored by the people in their world, how many lawyers would do a whole bunch of law if no one was paying them or reading their papers? It's a really I don't know, it's just a really interesting things that art is one of those things that people will do regardless of what people think, or in the absence of people thinking at all about what they're doing. Because for them it's a satisfying thing just for them to do it, the act of doing. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
That's okay. I'm just thinking though, in terms of rich and poor, and going back to a sort of more financial sense of that term, that, as you say, people kept plugging away at this even though they weren't making any money from it. If they were already poor, and yet they still did it, there's something so incredibly,
You're going to say romantic about that?
Well, there's the romantic element, of course. But actually, I don't think there is anything romantic about living in dire poverty.
No.
Is there?
And and a lot of times, I mean, you look at the letters to, between Vincent and Theo, or whatever it is, and he's just, oh, can I have some money? I got to buy some paints and all this kind of stuff. It's sort of scraping along to keep doing the thing that they're doing. There's some nobility. Would that be the word? I mean, there's like something about it that is, I don't know. It's, as somebody who is a, not a crazy successful artist myself, there are often times where I wonder, why do I bother doing all this stuff that half the people don't care about most of the time? And it's because ultimately I think it satisfies me. And I can imagine, I look at other people's work, and I can identify with that sort of sentiment and that kind of weird, to hell with them all emotion. You know what I mean? I don't know. Sorry, go ahead with Lowry. I just wanted to throw that in the mix.
I don't need to go ahead with Lowry. I mean, what you're saying ties in exactly, almost as if you knew this was coming.
Come on, say, read the quote with your accent. I want to hear it. Wait, no, this guy's British.
No, just be quiet. You can read it. You read it out for us.
No, I'm not going to read it out. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was explaining to Bill earlier, Simon Sharma is a kind of eminent historian, very well known, certainly in the UK. He wrote a really fascinating book called The Embarrassment of Riches, an interpretation of Dutch culture in the Golden Age, amongst many other books. Very well known in the UK for doing TV shows as well, in which he has unpacked and unpicked art history, for example. And often it's not even really in a populist way. It's in a very thoughtful, reflective, patient way. Anyway, a quote from the book I thought would be relevant here. Treating art as a kind of historical evidence has dangers for the unwary. Art filters the perception of the eye through the lens of moral sensibility. Now,
whose moral sensibility?
well,
The viewer or the artist?
I'm sure we could take this both ways, but I think probably in Sharma's case here, he means the viewer. It reminded me very much, Bill, of something you've said in one of our other dialogues that was about a kind of morality to looking, and how, when we look at the past, we do almost taint it with our own morality, and
Yeah.
that it's unavoidable that we do that. And I wonder, when we think about a sense of poverty, rich and poor, whether we're attaching a moral value to those extremes as well. It would be very easy for us to say that, a kind of stereotype cultural perception of poverty is something that might be described as bad.
Sure. I mean, yes. I mean, I think the standard moral implication is that rich is good and poor is bad. Ironically, if you go, for any Christians out there, if you really look, it's kind of the opposite based upon what Jesus says. But it is, yeah. I mean, I think that is a automatic thing. I think in some ways not, because it's not necessarily a value judgment on people who are poor, people who are rich, but that you yourself know that you would probably not want to be poor, and you probably would want to be rich, because it would make things so much easier or so much harder, respectfully.
Quite a few years ago,
But
I was in Ireland with a friend, and was attending a workshop in the Burren, which is in County Clare. And so the person running the workshop was a lovely person, Yola Bortoli, and she was running the workshop, and part of her generosity of that workshop was also she would provide lunch, and she's a fabulous cook. So we would sit around and she would cook us the most beautiful food. And along with me, there were a variety of other artists and art educators. We were talking at the table, and there was somebody at the table who was describing being on a trip to somewhere in India, and talking about seeing the children and being so concerned for their happiness. And someone else,
sure,
quite insightfully and incisively, pretty much reached across the table and berated this person for assuming that somebody who lives in poverty is unhappy, or that they are in actual fact emotionally impoverished, when in actual fact many people aren't, and that happiness, morality, poverty, wealth have their kind of independent satellites. They, to be very poor may cause some element of suffering, but that doesn't necessarily impact goodness or joy.
Yeah, all of those are three corners of a triangle that aren't necessarily related to each other. Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah, and there's, again, like we said, there's plenty of rich people who are emotionally empty. So it's a thing. Oh, here we go, Van Gogh.
Yeah, so Van Gogh is an obvious choice for any presentation with this title, because he did spend his short life living really in poverty. I mean, he didn't come from an impoverished background. but it wasn't an extremely wealthy background.
No.
We know obviously that he had a very loving, good relationship with his brother, who was such a thoughtful, caring element in Van Gogh's life when really all else was, turning to dirt. And this painting is from a period where Van Gogh had actually returned from England. He'd had a stint in London, and also in Kent. When he'd returned, he'd come back to Belgium, and he was working, or rather practicing, as a kind of preacher. And Theo was visiting him, Theo, his brother, and was horrified to find that Van Gogh had been so moved by the poverty of others, these extremely poor mining families, that he'd actually given all his clothes away, and he'd stopped washing, and he'd basically become what we might think of as kind of like a vagrant. But I think what's astonishing, and part of the kind of context of looking at a painting such as this, is that Van Gogh painted, in my opinion, with incredible compassion. Always this compassion for people. And it comes back to, again, something we were speaking about earlier, Bill, I think off camera, this idea that, we have, people who observe others who are poor, and people who understand those others, and that where there's no separation really between the painter and the subject. There's a collapse of that distance that allows for all those very negative judgments to rush in. I don't feel that Van Gogh is judging these women. I know he is seeing them to paint them, but I don't feel like he's judging them. And I think then the context that we might go and find out about this painting, and indeed this time of Van Gogh's life and him living in Belgium before he then moved down into France, is that he wanted to share in the life of this, not to be poor, but to be human.
Yep. Do you think, though, that you sort of, I don't know exactly the word you used, that basically shortening the distance between himself and these women by essentially, giving up the things that he had that they didn't have to them, by sort of living in a way that was more in keeping with the way that they lived. Is that, with somebody who is so mentally fragile like he was, is that identifying with them, or is that giving up on his self to sort of like letting go of almost his own identity in order to just fall into the pool with these people? Do you know what I mean?
Well, if he were an actor, we'd be giving him an Oscar for excellent method.
Yep.
But I think there's more to it than that. Van Gogh is a painter through and through, and he's known that for a long time within himself. But he hasn't really always been able to realise that. There was a lot of pressure that he ought not to be an artist. And so I think when we see paintings like this emerging, this is sort of 7 years before, about 7 years before he died. He's still actually a relatively young man. The evidence would suggest that he isn't giving up on himself. He's not giving up on humanity at all. He's embracing it. And back to the title, not to lose the focus of where we are with this. Rich and poor. How rich must somebody be inside to be able to give themselves up into what other people have, are? I think there's something so profoundly beautiful and moving in that. This is everything about giving up what we cling to as even identity, and not believing oneself to be separate from the key concern.
It's interesting. He's one of those artists that I look at their work and I think about the work that they made, and I am a big fan of Van Gogh. It's not like I'm not at all ripping on his work, but from the point of view of a somebody who who make stuff myself, sometimes I look at the sort of tragedy of his life and the unwellness mentally that he seemed to have for so much of it. And I sometimes I wonder, he went all through all of this to make this art. What did this art give him? He just suffered for most of it. You know what I mean? Like he suffered through most of his life. It's just and I don't know that he necessarily should or could have done anything else. I'm not saying that he should have gone and become a banker or something and he would have been happy. I think he probably would have been sad no matter what he did. That he just bad luck, as we were saying earlier about the roll of the dice when it comes to brain chemistry and stuff. But I it does make me sad, 120, 140 years later, just to think about this person suffering and trying to do the one thing that they think will bring them some joy. And I'd imagine that it was only ever temporary. And it just like there's something about it that just seems really heartbreaking to me.
I have a different take on this. I don't think that there was
Okay.
a direction. I don't think that there was a direction in Van Gogh's mind, really. I mean, I think he felt compelled to paint. It's not what I think. I mean, that's well documented. He was compelled to
Yeah.
paint. But I don't think, much as he, of course, did want to sell his work and he wanted to feel that golden beam of maybe not fame, but certainly somebody recognizing that he was talented beyond his
Yeah.
own.
Adulation from other people. Everybody wants external,
But
yeah.
I still don't get the sense that he was making painting in that greedy way of desiring something other.
No, but no, I think in some ways if that's what came across, that's not what I was trying to say. Uh, it's almost like being a drug addict and getting a fix. You know what I mean? It's like the satisfaction of doing it elevated him temporarily, and he had to keep coming back to it. It's not that it was an external thing. It was, if anything, it was very much something inside of him that he wanted to keep getting closer to that and away from whatever demons he had. And this was his way of doing it. But it ultimately just, I don't know. There is something always whenever I see any Van Gogh stuff, whether it's portraits or whether it's pictures of flowers or whether it's a landscape, they're always just incredibly lonely paintings to me. I always feel like it's, even
Well,
if he's with other people, even if the paintings are of other people, it always feels like I'm seeing it through his eyes from within his world, and that world is walled off from reality. Does that make any sense?
the lens of moral sensibility, Bill.
Yeah.
Um, there are a few things in that. I mean, there's real richness. And again, this is like saying, what romance is there in dire poverty? Well, actually,
Sure.
there's nothing romantic about dire poverty. It's shit.
Yep.
But there is still a romance about the impoverished artist. And also, there is incredible richness even in the depths of loneliness. There's
Sure. Well, I
richness.
I think if you take away other people and you take away possessions and you take away all of those things that sort of get in the way, it's funny. When we brought this up last time, I think I may have brought up William Eggleston, who's, I really I like Eggleston's photography. Anytime I've ever seen video of William Eggleston, it makes me want to slap him. But he's like a rich guy drunk from Kentucky or wherever the hell he's from, and he basically has been able to, you know, take pictures his whole life and not really worry about all that much. And I would say you could say that there is some freedom in that because he doesn't have to live by everybody else's rules. He can do what he wants. But in the same way, to roll it back to what you were saying, without the obligations of money, without the obligations of a career, without the obligations of other people, there is immense freedom in that as well from an artistic point of view. You know what I mean? Without having to worry about all these other things. You can have everything and have freedom, and you can have nothing and have freedom, and that
Yes,
freedom is actually really similar between those two things.
exactly. Most of us are caught, aren't we, somewhere in the middle of that?
Yeah,
And
yeah, and Van Gogh's is way down at one end, Eggleston's way up at the other end, and but ultimately they both have a similar sort of gift, as it were.
yeah, and I just want to go back to Lowry for a second. Lowry,
Sure.
there's a suggestion that Lowry had visited an exhibition by Van Gogh, and it was quite impactful for him. It really impacted him how he was able to sort of see the world, how he kind of realized his painting sensibility was influenced by Van Gogh. Lowry, as I said, I mean, he didn't grow up in dire poverty, but they certainly weren't wealthy. And he also grew up, as I've mentioned, in this strange, kind of quite emotionless, very controlled environment. Hugely domineering mother, very, very quiet, disappearing father. As Lowry got older and as he became more wealthy, he had quite a bizarre, I don't want to say hoarder instinct, but he inherited the house that he'd shared latterly with his mother. He never married. And when his dad died, and then when his mum eventually passed away after many years later, she left him a collection, a huge collection of clocks and other kind of trinkets. And when people would go round to the house, they would notice that, you know, the carpets were frayed and the furniture was battered, and the clocks were also all set at different times. Um, he, you know, apparently he really liked to deceive people. That kind of brought him some kind of pleasure. Any kind of tricksiness he could bring out, he enjoyed that. But the thing I was going to say is that he had drawings at home by Rossetti and by Freud. And of course, they are valuable, hugely valuable things. And even the clocks, as bizarre as it would have been, were actually quite a valuable collection. So he had these things of incredible value in his home, and yet he lived a very frugal existence.
Sure.
I don't even think frugal is the right word. Maybe mean.
Well, just because you have money doesn't mean that you care about money.
Well, I don't know if it was. Well, I'm going to maybe take back the word mean then. Exactly. He didn't appear to care about money. And I wonder if it was after all those years of observing really the working class in the industrial north of England, where he realised that no matter how shadowless and faceless they were, they also still had the capacity for everything anybody had the capacity for, whether they were in fact rich or poor. And when we come back to this painting, and we're thinking about Van Gogh and what I said there, you know, Theo arrived to visit him, having not seen him when he was over in England for a while, and he was horrified. In fact, they fell out. It's the longest period that they didn't correspond was after the visit to see Van Gogh at this particular area in Belgium, because Theo was horrified. You know, his brother was smelly, he was wearing rags, but just the sense that, again, Van Gogh had given all of this up, not for an affectation, not to pretend at being poor, but because there was maybe a sense of oneness about that. You know, a sense of oneness.
Or,
Lots of stuff in philosophy about this. We could look to the Far East for this, you know, wabi-sabi kind of branches of Zen, where there's a voluntary state of poverty, where people are giving up into poverty, and also giving up into not knowing, giving up into nothing, something very pure about it.
yeah, but in the case of him, do you think that there is a more simple or a simple explanation just based upon mental illness, and that it wasn't a conscious choice? He was just a little crazy and like sort of fell into this world and lost himself in it. That it wasn't a choice. It was just like inertia made him fall that way. You know what I'm saying? Like I'd say in somebody who is psychologically straight. I mean, even Lowry used to, like, later in life he had money, but he like had frayed carpets. Well, it's easy to not care about your carpets when you know you could always buy a new carpet. You know what I mean? Like there is a certain freedom even in, there's a freedom to be poor even if you have money. You know what I'm saying? Which is also a thing. And I mean, I famously, I can't betray confidence, but there was a photographer in the 20th century who was very well known later in life, who I know for one never actually cashed checks for the prints that were sold of his. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of checks, and they found them in his house after he died because he never cashed them. And so he could have lived such a greater life and chose not to, because why? Who knows? You know what I mean? I guess we'll never know because it's too late. He's gone. Um, People are. It's a weird thing. Like, we try in life, I think, to put people into groups, and the thing that always surprises me is ultimately what it comes down to is how different individuals are.
Yes.
As much as we try to chop people up, yes, I'm a man, yes, I'm American, yes, I'm a photographer, yes, I'm whatever, you know what I mean? Like, you can put me in all these different categories, but the intersection of all those things is far more interesting than any category you could put you or I into, you know?
But at the same
Um,
time, we're talking about extremes that end up actually being remarkably similar, where we have someone that's very, very wealthy has the same kind of freedom, perhaps, as somebody who's absolutely nothing.
yeah,
And
yeah.
there's also the sense that in being different from each other, we're also all exactly the same, really.
It is interesting though that you could have somebody who is poor and they can be different from one another because they really don't care what other people think, right? You could have somebody who's rich and can be different from everyone else because they can afford to be different than everybody else. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's interesting that you can end up at the same place at the extremes. Everything comes around and connects on the other side of the circle. Um,
I also think it's
yeah,
really fascinating that you and I, who are both extraordinarily privileged, we both do jobs we enjoy, we both have homes that we live in. We don't want for things.
yep.
I wonder if even we're qualified to talk about this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, I I materially have, I'm not from some crazy rich family. I don't have a giant trust fund or anything like that. I work for my wages so that I can eat. But, but at the same time, like, I had a somewhat emotionally difficult upbringing. I mean? So there are all of those elements that are all still in there that even if you came from some sort of privilege, whether it's, racial or gender, nationality or whatever it is, like, there are still elements of things that you can't judge other people on because you didn't walk in their shoes. You know what I mean? Their whole life. Um, so yeah, I mean, you're right. It is difficult, but I mean, I don't think we're making any judgments on these people whether or not they should or could or whatever say do the things they thought. Andy Warhol, right?
Don't lose your train of
God,
thought.
I'm just saying that I don't feel guilty in that you and I are making some judgment and saying stuff that somehow we're only allowed to say because we're privileged. I think we're making observations about humanity in some ways.
But also, are we? This is maybe more subtle than I can make it sound with the language I use. Are we actually judging it? Is what we're doing now another form of kind of observation? You know, neither of us are rushing to condemn anyone.
Sure. Do you think we should be?
No, I don't know if there's any cause for any
If
either.
anything, I feel empathy towards the people that we are discussing in a lot of ways, both the artists and the subjects, and the whole thing is just the entirety of the human condition is it's far deeper and yet far simpler than a lot of people, I think, make it out to be. I think a lot of people make things out to be complex, and I think life is long and complicated and and very rarely easy, no matter how you come at it. Living is complicated. Are these the one? These are. Is this the set at MoMA?
Mhm.
Yeah, they keep moving them around. I think I sent you a picture. Did I send you a picture of these the other day?
I don't know, Bill. I was bombarded with photographs from MoMA the other day. No,
I was like, let me go in this room. I'm gonna send that to Sandy, and that to Sandy, and that to Sandy.
I ignored so many of them. No, I didn't. But yes, this is at MoMA. It's the kind of iconic image. There's
Yep.
Warhol.
Do you like Warhol in general?
No, but that's not. Again, this is coming back to the sense of judgment. No, I don't like Warhol's work, especially. I see an incredible mileage in studying it, though.
Yeah.
I see it.
Discussing Warhol and his process and his and every the ideas around it are far more interesting than the actual work, in my opinion.
Well, that's maybe the point of it, though, isn't it? It's excellent for me across all age ranges. It mustn't think that I teach year 7 all about pop art, and we look at Warhol, and those students are age 11 and 12. But that mustn't then mean that he becomes kind of somehow again diminished into this easy to swallow, bite-sized, childlike resource. He's actually profoundly important, as we know, in the course of art history. But again, coming back to our topic of rich and poor, I found it interesting when I was looking through lots of other people's blogs and things that there's like a Quora discussion thread about artists who'd been brought up in poverty. Nobody mentions Warhol, and I wonder why, because actually he did have very meager means as a child.
Was he? He had siblings, but was raised by just the mother, I think, in Pittsburgh. Is that what it was?
Well, no, his mum and dad had a child when they were still living in what was Czechoslovakia, and the child had died, and then they had another child, and they emigrated to the US, and they had then another 2 children. So they had 3 sons, living sons, and they lived together. The dad was a kind of a labourer of some sort. The mum was very artistic, actually. She was an embroiderer, but they did all kinds of jobs, menial jobs to try and make ends meet. But sadly, Warhol's dad died. There's actually, do you know what? You can look on Wikipedia and you could say that it says Warhol's dad died in 1942 of an accident, I think it says. But actually,
okay,
you do a bit of digging. Some people say he died of cirrhosis of the liver, and I'm not quite sure why his dad died. But when Andy Warhol was still, I think he was maybe 12 years old, his dad passed away. And his dad had been hugely, hugely supportive of Andy's drive to be an artist, and so was his mum. As I said, his mum herself was very creative, very talented artistically. She worked to embroider things. She made things. She went door to door to sell the little things she would make, little covered vases and things. But a lot of the stuff about the soup can transports us directly back to Andy's childhood. He was always allowed to pick the flavour of soup. But I think what's very telling is the fact that the family, the mum and the children, were eating a can of soup. You could maybe, it wouldn't be difficult to read into that times were really tough for them.
Yeah.
And yes, Warhol's work is a comment on popular culture. We've become so used to it. It has become again this idea of like having wallpaper.
Yeah.
That it, it does it retain its value because it's so overused? Well, actually, yes. I think when we start to peel away the immediate sense of this work, and we think a little bit about Warhol or Warhola, was his name. He's mimicking and bringing forward from his past, I think, things that are much more meaningful than even he allowed the world to know.
Well, I think there's a little bit. I mean, if the story you just told, assuming that it's true, this is it. It ends up giving an air of sort of a Citizen Kane Rosebud concept to the cans, and that some of the analysis that people do of his art later, that the reality of his psychological whims that led to a lot of the things that he made and did were far simpler and created far earlier than an adult psychology of choosing what he's going to make. You know what I'm saying? That 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 maybe he didn't do it for the reasons that art historians and thinkers were when they were analyzing that stuff without knowing a whole lot about his childhood. Maybe that's the simpler answer. You know what I mean? It's Occam's razor of psychological thought.
Also, I just do want to mention when his dad was still alive as well. One of the reasons why he was so kind of adored and cosseted within his family unit by both his brothers and his parents was that he'd been very sickly. He had, I think it's called St. Vitus dance. It's a kind of palsy that makes your extremities kind of judder and move. And he also had a kind of, I think, something to do with pigmentation on his skin that made him extremely self-conscious. He spent long periods of his childhood in bed, apparently, and by all accounts, his mum would give him pencils, color pencils, drawing books. And so, again, just to give a little bit of context, this was a very poor immigrant family who ended up basically transplanting their culture into the US. So they were profoundly religious. The young Warhol would have grown up attending church. In fact, everybody apparently thought he was going to be a priest because he met that kind of criteria. He was thoughtful, quiet. He was otherwise kind of a bit physically perhaps perceived to be quite weak. And so the priesthood was meant to be like a, direct line to God. It would have been such an accolade within the family and within the small community where they had settled. But as this sickly child and having these kind of physical or health related issues, America was learned, like American culture was learned in quite a sort of bizarre way because it wasn't necessarily experienced firsthand, that it was learned about through magazines. And you can really see how he ended up studying commercial art, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting when people look at some later Warhol stuff, just the simple screen print kind of stuff. Yeah. And they're like, he's no artist, he can't even draw. And it's like, no, Warhol could draw. Like, in the same way Picasso could draw, and like, all these people. It's. I always find that cop out from people who are not sort of art literate, who sort of dismiss a lot of artwork by people as these people not having skills. And it's like, no, they made it that way because they chose to make it that way, not because they couldn't make it better. And it's just it's always a little pet peeve of mine. But go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think the only thing else I would say about this is that when I see work like this, much as I don't love this work, I'm not going to rush and see it again anytime soon. I am really interested.
You're not going to go to MoMA with me and see these next time you come visit?
If you must. But anyway, we would go and see it, and probably what I would think would be I would be reminded of something that's about a spark of joy in a life that otherwise was very difficult.
Yeah.
And actually,
also, sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Just the representation of all the different flavors of soup. That's something that's actually quite poignant. Poignant, not in that way that's about even about decimating sadness, but just poignant and full of pathos. Who knew that Warhol's work was full of pathos?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's also the idea that he grew up poor, he became rich. He was definitely one of those people who flaunted his societal value and wealth later. You know what I mean? Like he was flamboyant and very much a member of that sort of set of society. But there's also a part of it that says, look, I can have any of these things that I want now. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah, but
I had to choose when I was a kid, and now I have everything.
let's not
Um,
forget, you're using the word flamboyant. You know, Warhol was extremely and intensely interested in his appearance. And that was
yeah,
born out of something that is to do with another very dark
but but he
aspect.
also wanted to be seen at the same time. You know what I mean? Like you don't hang out at Studio 54 and have giant parties at your loft and that kind of stuff if you don't want to be. That is not something somebody does who's an introvert who doesn't want some sort of justification or external validation. You know what I mean?
However,
Um,
I think that on balance, we could also say, or I might assume, that what Warhol was doing there in those kinds of places, and you use the word flamboyant, I wouldn't use that word. He was a businessman. There's a quote again, I don't want to get it wrong, but it's something like, I make art and art makes money, or something that Warhol said. It reminds me very much of what a more contemporary artist, Damien Hirst, of young British artist infamy,
sure.
and sharks and formaldehyde and dot paintings and uh, all the kind of bizarre antics of his um, oeuvre. We're looking at somebody who is a businessman, who is set on making money, who wants to be rich. I think there's no question that Warhol
Sure.
actually probably did want to be rich. So rather than being wanting
Sure.
to be noticed, he simply realized the expediency of being noticed to be rich.
Yeah, maybe. And the hair and the whole thing.
Yeah, but
It's
the wig was there because he was crushingly self-conscious about the way he looked.
yeah, it's always there is a weird yeah, the whole wanting to be seen but also being incredibly self-conscious is a common theme for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
And it's like getting down into the psychology of that is something we can discuss another time. Martin Parr walking around with his
Bill, you know what we
I don't
really
know.
have to work on? We really have to work on your gentle segues between slides.
I know. It's something about Martin Parr's photography. This is just it. Whenever I think about 1980s America, 1980s England, this is all I ever see is Martin Parr photographs in my head.
I think for a lot of people, there would be no separation between what was actually 1980s England and what is a Martin Parr photograph, to be honest.
Do you think that people in England who even know who Martin Parr is? Because I mean, you and I know Martin Parr. I don't know that my mother knows any Martin Parr photographs or knows who Martin Parr is. Famously, Martin Parr, right, had a hard time getting into Magnum, right? He like that they didn't want him in or something like that.
But he stood the test of time, hasn't he? I mean, his work now is just as relevant. And
Yeah,
actually,
totally.
in terms of like a canon of like this ironic archival footage of an entire culture, I don't know what else we really have. This is
Do you think that people are embarrassed by Martin Parr photographs, British people? Because Martin Parr's photographs of British people do not show British people in the best light.
no, but I think what's fascinating about this is that this is again back to that Sharma quote, where we're looking at this immediately from a position. We are looking at this through a lens of morality. We are
And of 40 years later,
moving into judgment. I said earlier that you and I aren't actually being judgmental. Well, much as we might not be judgmental now about Martin Parr as such, we are, of course, being incredibly judgmental about what we see. And actually,
hold on a second. I just asked if you think other people like find it whatever. I'm not making any judgment about the people in this photograph.
oh, really, Bill? What do you think about these people in the photograph?
Well, they're trash, but no, I'm just kidding.
I'm going to
No,
have to be editing these because this is, we really.
People could take that out of context and not know that I was kidding. No, but I do wonder though, because in my experience, the sort of larger British culture is somewhat concerned with their appearance and the way that they live their lives and are seen by the world. And his photographs do show sort of what some people would call like lower middle, like lower class sort of, like beach scenes and all this kind of stuff that is the sort of not underbelly of British society, but certainly not the glossy royals end of British society. And I was just wondering, do you think that people in England, particularly Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, can hold their thing, but people in England look at this stuff and say, why'd you take pictures of, people with a bunch of trash around them in 1985?
I think any person at any point could feel self-conscious about what they see and perceive of themselves in an image. I mean,
Sure.
I'm not trying to be evasive, but we could go back to the Van Gogh painting.
Sure.
And show that painting to some miners and miners' wives.
They'd be like, why'd you make me look like such a dowdy, whatever, yeah.
Yeah, so, all art.
You think it's, well, hold on a second. Do you think that it's different because it's a photograph and not a painting? Because that actually is that woman eating chips or whatever she's eating. You know what I'm saying? That like it's different. If photography is different in that sense.
I think it has a slightly different load to its language.
Yeah.
And I think there's always a danger, isn't there, with a photograph, that what we see is so, it is actually recognizable, as you say. That woman in that image, she might happen upon this photograph. I wonder if Parr was rushing around with like little release forms saying, "Oh, do you mind if I use this photograph?" And
No, you don't need to for art, at least in America. You don't. Do you need to in England?
No, there's that. Well, I don't want to get the law wrong, but I suspect that you don't have to. That good etiquette say yes, you ought to.
Yeah, I doubt that Martin Parr has ever asked anybody for a model release.
I'm gonna go find that out actually, because that really interests me.
My guess is that would be the antithesis of what he's trying to do.
Yeah, but let's not forget. I mean, Parr has photographed supposed wealth.
Sure, of course, yeah.
And yet,
but most of the pictures that you see are.
He still manages to make it look what we might think of as trashy. He makes everything look kind of grotesque in a way.
Yeah.
And actually, maybe Parr's work, yes, and in this case is very much shining that light. You called it like the underbelly of British or English culture. But actually, it's just people. And again, there's this enormous leveler across his photographs, which is that anyone can look like crap. Anyone can look seamy or seedy. Anyone can look like they're a real loser. But I think that's also so much more about how we, the viewer, are meeting these photographs.
There's also a preponderance of ketchup in his photographs, I've noticed.
You can't have chips without ketchup.
No, of course not. God, I could totally go for some fries right now. That sounds really good.
So I use this photograph a lot with A-level students to draw out their dark underbelly of their judgment.
Sure.
It's really interesting.
Let me ask you a question. Which bothers you more? The people there and the family and the sort of, I don't know, dismissiveness of this kid, like the whole energy of that family, or the trash on the ground right in front of them? Which bothers you more? Or which do you bump on more?
It's the trash on the ground.
Yeah, me too. Something about overflowing trash cans that drives me crazy. Like it just irks me.
I'm going to say that there's a thing in parenting, which is like you're a good enough parent. You don't have to be like stratospherically great parent. You can just be a good enough parent. And there's like a whole parenting movement that is about being a good enough parent, which means that basically your children are relatively clean and they're fed, and anything else is kind of left up to chance. And I
Yeah,
totally,
and to some extent they need to figure it out on their own too, because they're
you know,
you know.
we could rush in with, I can imagine Mumsnet viewers would be rushing immediately and typing in, dreadful parents, shameful abdication of parental responsibility. Not only are they eating near rubbish, but they're eating chips. You can really imagine the vitriol that would be spouted out about this family. Um,
Wasn't famously like 80% of British school children did not know that fries were potatoes? Jamie Oliver found that out or something. Wasn't there some kind of terrible thing a few years ago?
yeah, I think these kinds of like cultural idiosyncrasies, it's like a whole movement in the last 15 to 20 years in the UK about food, about kind of conscious parenting. Uh,
Sure.
it's all become so tied in with being woke. It it misses the point when we're looking at work like this. And when we come back to our title of Rich and Poor, we go back to that quote by Sharma. We're looking at all of this through the lens of our own morality.
Hold on a second. How else is there to take this? I
Well,
mean,
how else is there to take this? I think really what I'm kind of getting at is that I don't really think there's a place for individuals responding to what they see. I don't think there's a place for those individuals in response being in any way kind of castigated. Of course, we ought to be held to account if we are being horrible, but at the same time, we are so apologetic for being judgmental. And you're
yeah.
right, it's unavoidable that we rush with judgment to what we see. And actually, throughout all of the conversations you and I have had about all different kinds of art, each time we've somehow moved into position. We might try and kid ourselves, perhaps, that we're not being judgmental. In fact, even earlier in this conversation, I said that we weren't being judgmental.
Yeah.
Bring us to this photograph, and you and I are both being judgmental. I'm going to go out on a limb there and just say that I think you're being judgmental as well when you're looking at this.
Oh, absolutely, and I don't deny that. I mean, it's not conscious judgmentalism in the sense that like I'm not looking at it trying to find things, but there is an immediate sort of my blink response is ew, you know. But I mean that's the case with a lot of Martin Parr's images in particular, which is I think part of the reason why he's noticed and thought of in that way
Yeah,
is
but
that he elicits that response. No.
the elicited response is perhaps like the Marie Antoinette complex in all of us. Let them go and eat cake, those filthy
Sure.
scum people over there. I just wonder, as a comparison, are we thinking the same about these people? We
No,
might.
because that was 140 years ago.
Okay, but let's just think about this. These people we know these people would have been dirt poor, the true
Yep.
description.
Yep.
They lived in freezing hovels. They lived on
Yep.
potato. They wore threadbare clothes at best. They suffered, their bodies ached with physical labor. This is poverty.
Yeah. And in a way that it's like I never liked the idea of when people sort of romanticize poverty. Like all those things are true, but those people didn't want to be like that. That's the best they could do. You know what I mean?
Is this the best these people can do?
Maybe. Yeah.
And what do we think about Martin Parr choosing to record them?
It's a lot of times I look at this kind of stuff and I put Martin Parr in that category of photographers, not gotcha photographers, but they're all right. they're looking for that thing that is out of place in order to shine a light on it. Not trying to make people look bad, but they're okay with making people look bad if it's going to elicit a response from the viewer. It's not my mode of photography, but I do a very different thing. But like, so when I look at this, I just think I would never take that picture. Martin Parr is Martin Parr because he does want to take that picture. He's looking for that picture.
I mean, like, is there we can say shining a light on culture, right?
Sure.
But shining a light on culture in this way, and exclusively shining a light on culture in this way, what do we think of him for doing that? Is there a sense of
the question is, why is he doing it? Is he doing it so to bring awareness of it so that culture changes? Is he doing it to embarrass those people? Is he doing it just as a businessman to make money? Is he doing it because he thinks that it makes good art because it shows some level of the human condition? I mean, there's like, 20,000 ways to go look at it, and I haven't read enough interviews to know why Martin Parr does exactly what he does, or to put my spin on it, as always, whether in an interview he'd actually even tell us why he's really doing it, or whether he'd just be selling us some line of why he does it in order to maintain some sense of, whatever. But I think that there's,
for rich and poor across everything we've looked at, like, why does Martin Parr do it? Why does Andy Warhol do it? Why does Van Gogh do it? Why does Lowry do it?
I think that in the case of Martin Parr, separate from all the rest of them, I think he's specifically doing it to highlight those people in a weird, embarrassing way that I don't think the other the painters that you've listed are.
Okay, so is Martin Parr is Martin Parr at best making fun of a stereotype?
Yeah, I think I that's not a terrible description of what I think he is doing. Yeah. Can I tell you though what's, go ahead.
Is Lowry in any way making fun of people who lose their identity through the anonymization of the industrial working class?
No, I think he's identifying with them in the same way that Van Gogh was.
Okay.
And I think there are photographers who take pictures of people in quote unquote lower classes who are not doing it. I mean, God, what was the hell's the guy's name? It's gonna drive me crazy. Who's the guy who shot all of the kids in factories? I mean, even all of the WPA photographers, Dorothea Lange and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that Migrant Woman is looking at that woman in a way that's trying to make her look bad. Migrant Mother.
When we look at Migrant Mother as a photograph, there's no passive element in that photograph.
No.
Whereas, I come back this sense of, an artist really in whatever mode they choose to express through, whether they are kind of passive in the observation of something because they see it, or whether they are recording something because they are it. Dorothea Lange wasn't recording Migrant Mother because she was it.
Right.
Nor was she passive in the observation of it because she knew she had to hang some kind of political angle on it.
Right, because all that work was done for that purpose. I mean, it was propaganda, right? Yeah.
Is this a propaganda drive about poverty? Of course it's not. Is this?
No, I think that is personal psychology being put onto 32 canvases. It's interesting. I mean, where I think Martin Parr does not identify with those people. I think he's voyeuristically looking at those people from a different position. You know what's funny about it though? When I look at this picture, you know what the first thing I think when I see this picture? It's not the people. It's not Martin Parr. All I can think of is I bet you he shot that on a Mamiya 7 rangefinder, medium format rangefinder.
Oh, you're such a
It's
nerd.
just it's so weird. I just see that and I go, oh yeah, 6.7 medium format film. Like this is my problem.
Wow.
You got any final thoughts?
I think this is a really rich topic. I actually think we could revisit this with a whole different set of images.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Yeah, have a real look at this. I really like the idea of us picking out those characters from art history who have come from incredible privilege. But
Yeah,
I also do sort of wonder, like, what are we doing? Like, what are you and I doing? What are we looking for in this?
I think having these conversations, I see having conversations with you about this stuff a little bit like going to therapy. It's like we have these conversations so that we put into words what's going on in our heads so that we can better understand what's going on in our heads. And ultimately, that informs how you teach and informs how I photograph. I mean, I think it's good to think about the reasons why we think what we think. And
Mm.
I think that it doesn't need to be any deeper or have any more meaning than that.
Well, thanks, Bill Wadman, for that very insightful parting shot. It doesn't need to be deeper or more meaningful. That's the message.
Isn't it enough that we get to spend this hour and a half with each other every week?
Yes, Bill.
All right. Thank
Well,
you, Sandy.
thank you. Bye, everyone.